Rain stitched a thin gray veil over the south side that afternoon, and Jamal Williams stepped through it with his hood up, the fabric of his favorite black hoodie catching beads of water that glimmer beneath the street lamps like stubborn stars refusing to be drowned. He moved quickly along the cracked sidewalk, sneakers squeaking, breath feathering in the cold, one hand guarding the folded registration form inside his pocket, as if it were a passport to a country that rarely granted him entry. The school auditorium rose ahead, broad-shouldered and tired, its concrete face streaked by years of weather and worries, its doors yawning open to swallow students and parents and clusters of laughter that sounded, to him, like a language he had never been taught. Inside, the light turned warm and honeyed, and the smell of floor polish, popcorn, and rain-damp cloth met him with familiarity that did not invite comfort. He wiped his shoes on the rubber mat, pushed the hood closer to his brow against the draft, and stepped into the flow of bodies and voices that thinned around in the way water bends around a stone. A pair of adults near the welcome table paused mid-conversation, eyes snagging on his silhouette as if a sudden shadow had crossed the sun. One whispered something that lifted the corner of the other's mouth into a tight line. The volunteer at the table pointed, not unfriendly but not warm, to a stack of programs, and then, when he reached for one, withdrew her hand as though remembering a rule she could not quite name. A couple of boys from his English class, their hair wild with gel and their shirts stiff with effort, laughed too loudly and then pretended not to see him, the laughter trailing behind them like ribbon. A girl in a glittering dress pulled her little brother closer by the wrist, and the boy, round-eyed and curious, peered up at Jamal with the unfiltered gaze of someone who had not yet learned to assign danger to a color or a garment. The security guard by the exit, a broad man with a polite mustache and a walkie-talkie that crackled with static, peeled away from the wall as Jamal drifted past, not intercepting him, merely adjusting his orbit to a line behind him. The way a moon is caught by a planet's pull. Jamal kept his head still and his eyes soft, absorbing faces, cataloging noises, letting the buzz of the auditorium blend into a manageable hum. The stage was alive with last-minute motion, curtains breathing, a girl in sequins testing her microphone with a bird-bright voice that bounced off the rafters. He knew how he looked, tall for his age but still a boy, jaw not yet set, shoulders unconvinced of breadth, hoodie soft with many washings, sleeves a touch too long, the fabric gathered at his wrists like a habit he refused to break. He did not take the hood down. It was raining outside. It was cold. He was not an apology with legs. He was a person with a plan. At the edge of the stage, a woman in a navy blazer and sensible shoes was flipping through a clipboard with the controlled intensity of someone moving sandbags ahead of a storm. Her hair was tied back in a silvery tail, and her mouth was efficient. Ms. Mackenzie, he knew from the flyers, the performing arts teacher who had helped organize the night, guardian of the running order, and, for the next few hours, the metronome by which dozens of hearts would keep time. When she noticed him, her attention sharpened the way a camera lens clicks into focus. She stepped forward, crossing the boundary between stage and floor with the air of someone who protects a door by standing in it. Rain glistened on the shoulders of his hoodie, and a drop fell to the scuffed wooden boards like a quiet punctuation mark. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked. The words perfectly polite and perfectly chilled, as if wrapped in paper and stored behind glass. He could hear the sentence that stood behind the sentence, the one too impolite to be spoken, the one that had followed him down hallways and past shop windows, and across streets, since he had learned that silence can be a shield. He nodded once, slow enough to show there was no rush here, no emergency in his presence, and kept his voice low and steady. "I am here for the talent show," he said. "I am one of the participants." Her eyes flicked to the security guard and back, as though confirming that backup existed, then rested on his pocket, with a corner of a paper peaked like a cautious bird. "Are you sure you have the right event?" she asked, and the question tucked itself into his ribs like a pebble worried into a shoe. He did not let it give him a limp. He slipped the folded form from his pocket. The ink blurred slightly where his damp fingers had held it during the walk. His name and grade, an act written in neat letters learned from a grandmother who believed careful handwriting was a kind of respect. "It is my registration," he said. "I turned in last week, but I brought a copy just in case." He offered the page. She took it, her fingers brushing the paper with the hesitance of someone accepting a note passed in class, then lowered her gaze to read. He watched her mouth as if the act of reading might soften it. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly over his name, over the word, spoken word printed under the category line, over the time slot penciled in with brisk practicality. He had known she would find the proof. He had counted on it. The rain had not smudged the truth away. "Right," she said, a small clearing of the throat like a chalkboard wiped just enough to write a new line. "Yes, Jamal Williams. You are scheduled for the second half." The words arranged themselves into a bridge, not welcoming exactly, but passable. She looked up again, seeing him now as a line on a list rather than an anomaly in need of explanation. The tiny recalibration registered in her posture, shoulders lowering a fraction, chin easing out of its defensive tilt. "Find a seat near the front," she added. "When we call you, be ready. And if you have a backing track or any special needs, let me know." He shook his head. His hands were empty. His voice was the track. He thanked her. The security guard, confronted with paperwork rather than intuition, drifted back toward his post as if embarrassed that gravity had made a fool of him in public. Jamal moved the aisle, stepping aside to let a mother pass with a stroller, and entered the plan of the audience, where light pooled gold across rows of folding chairs, and the chatter of expectation thickened the air. He sat 2 seats from the aisle, knees angled inward, Hoodie absorbing the auditorium's warmth like a stone absorbs afternoon sun. From here he could see the wings where performers clustered, warming up, clutching props, adjusting hair, adjusting courage. A boy tuned the guitar with reverent care, each note plucked like a secret shared only with the instrument. A duo in matching vests whispered choreography counts, their lips ticking through numbers too fast for a stranger to follow. Laughter rose and fell, a tide he did not wade into. He pressed his palms on his thighs and felt the slow pulse in them. He had learned to keep that rhythm. He had learned that breath can be a rope you climb hand over hand. He had learned that a hood can be a roof under which words are stored, drying out, ready to kindle. Around him, students and parents flipped through programs, the paper whispering as if exchanging gossip about the shapes words might take. From the back row came the crinkle and tear of candy wrappers, and from somewhere near the front, a cough as delicate as a bird landing. Near the judges' table, 3 clipboards sat like small shields. The judges themselves were arriving, shrugging off coats, trading handshakes, pretending they had not been volunteered for a duty that would swallow their evening whole. One was a local radio intern whose coat looked too thin for the stubborn Midwestern wind. One was a math teacher with round glasses that reflected the stage lights so perfectly he seemed already half illuminated. The third, a man with a tidy beard and a tie patterned with tiny diamonds, leaned over the list of names and tilted the page so that the light fell just right. Jamal did not strain to hear. He had trained his ears to pick out the threads that mattered. The man traced a finger down the page and let a chuckle slip, not loud, not intended for anyone beyond his small circle of comfort. "Every year there are a few surprises," he murmured to the math teacher, voice pitched in the register of people who are sure they're being reasonable. "But I am hoping for real talent tonight, not the usual noise certain types of boys mistake for art." The math teacher's mouth tightened in a way that could have been dissent or digestion. The radio intern looked at her hands. Jamal kept his gaze on the stage, spine straight, breath steady. The words he had carried through rain and sidewalk inside, eye coiling in the quiet behind his teeth, bright and ready. By Monday morning the school had already returned to its ordinary churn. Lockers slamming like brief thunder, sneakers squeaking through the halls, announcements rattling over the intercom in a cheerful tone that never quite matched the weather inside anyone's chest. Jamal moved through it quietly, as if the building were a library that did not know it was one. He kept to the edges, shoulders angling to avoid collisions, the hood gathering the fluorescent light into a dim halo that let him carry a private night around in the middle of day. At lunch, he ate at the far end of a long table where the chatter blurred into a single harmless engine, the kind you stop hearing after a few minutes of driving. Someone a few seats down mimicked a siren, and then laughed, and a friend of that someone said the word hoodie with the kind of theatrical innocence that is a dare. Jamal did not look up. He counted the bites it took to finish an apple and filed the number beside lines he had been shaping since before dawn. Words that kept wanting to rhyme with words he did not care to speak aloud. Rehearsal after school brought him into the windowless theater classroom where the stool legs whispered against the floor and the walls had posters of old performances curling at the corners like leaves at the end of a season. Students practiced in pockets of noise, a trumpet clearing its throat, a dancer cracking her joints like tiny knuckles of rain against glass. When it was his turn, he stood on the taped X and read his piece in a voice that stayed low and level, the syllables flowing without decoration, the way a river runs even when nobody is watching. He did not lift the hood. It was not drama, it was comfort. A few kids seated cross-legged at the front traded glances that were easy to translate, and one of them, a boy with bright scarf and a habit of talking with his hands, as if the air were clay to be shaped, raised his voice just enough to be overheard, remarking that the stage lights might get moody if they could not see a face. Laughter came in an obliging ripple. Jamal let the uninvited note pass, the way you let an ambulance pass, because everyone knows the road must be cleared. He finished, nodded to the floor, and stepped back. Ms. Mackenzie, fussing with index cards on a music stand like a ship's captain checking a map by lamplight, gave him a thumbs up that looked practiced, kind, and exactly the size of the distance between approval and understanding. The days fell into a pattern that was both comforting and tiring because of how much energy it took to keep its edges intact. He would leave school and cross 2 long blocks to the corner store, where the windows wore posters for lottery tickets and energy drinks like badges. He would stock shelves, sweep aisles, break down cardboard, and take cash from people who could be polite or mean, but were all mostly in a hurry. The store owner, Mr. Shah, kept a radio near the register that clung to a jazz station when it could, and when it could not, it surrendered to static. Toward evening, the city's noise thinned the way soup thins when you add too much water. Jamal liked that hour because his thoughts grew louder without anyone having to hear them. He would invent a line while pulling a crate of oranges forward, revise it while counting change, test its strength while nodding to someone's story about a bus delay, and then carry the tested line like a match unlit in his pocket. Certain teachers became weather fronts he learned to predict. In English, Mr. DeMarco asked the class to bring in a poem they loved, and when Jamal handed over a page filled with his own careful script, the teacher's eyebrows rose into question marks that never quite returned to periods. "Ambitious," he said, his tone gentle the way a dentist is gentle. "You might consider some classic pieces for context. There's a dress code in literature, too." In the hallway after last period, a guidance counselor whose name he kept forgetting because a man introduced himself with a handshake every time they met, stopped him to offer a pamphlet about professional presentation with photos of smiling kids in pastel shirts, the kind of smiles that make the air smell like printer ink. "Just thinking ahead to interviews and such," the counselor said, as if he could tuck preparation like a handkerchief into Jamal's pocket and be done with him. Jamal tucked the pamphlet into his backpack without a sound. He knew well that there are many dialects of advice, and some carry the accent a distance. He lived with his grandmother in a small apartment whose quiet had the weight of care in it. The living room was a testimony of stubborn tenderness. Crocheted blankets folded like folded hands, a clock that chimed softly as though mindful of neighbors, a stack of church bulletins that smelled faintly of perfume and paper that had been touched by many fingers. The kitchen was where stories were told without being told, the kettle giving the same sigh at the same minute each night, the spice jars lying like saints at the back of a narrow shelf. His grandmother moved through these rooms with a steadiness that disguised how carefully she measured each step. Some days breath was easy, some days it was a hill. She hated the oxygen machine's thin whine. So they negotiated. She would sit near the window where air felt less used, and he would not fuss every time she raised a hand to wave him off. After dinner, which tried hard to be hearty even when the refrigerator asked for forgiveness, Jamal would clear the dishes and then take out the notebook that looked like nothing to anybody else. He wrote after the city got tired, after buses sighed their last impatient sighs along the avenue, after the building had found its night rhythm of elevators, televisions, pipes, and human hearts. On those nights, he wrote about absences as if they were rooms you could walk through and describe accurately. The absence shaped like a father, the absence that wore his mother's perfume for only a few weeks before the scent faded, the absence that sat in a bed during storms and counted seconds between lightning and thunder because someone had to pretend to be the grown-up. He wrote about the peculiar talent you acquire when you learn to listen for what people mean underneath what they say. He did not dress the lines up. He did not give them metaphors like fireworks. He sanded them until the grain showed, then set them side by side to see which one stood. Sometimes, just before 2 a.m, when the notebook's paper had grown warm beneath his hand, he would catch a sentence mid-breath and think, This one is true enough to carry me across a room full of strangers who think they already know the weight of me. At school, the rehearsals escalated from casual to urgent. The stage crew taped cables to the floor with solemnity that rivaled ritual, and the lighting board learned the quirks of a bulb that would agree to glow only if addressed first. The singer with the sequin-bright voice asked him, not unkindly, whether his poem was like rap or like something else, and when he answered that it was simply the truth arranged in lines that could hold it, she nodded as if she understood anyway. A photographer from the yearbook hovered near the doorway capturing candid shots, and in one of them Jamal caught his own reflection later, hood up, hand still, face half in shadow, and thought how strange it is to be reduced to a shape that strangers think is a sentence. The afternoon before the show, a teacher he barely knew stopped him by the stairwell to suggest that he might consider polishing the look, which was a delicate way to say what he already knew. People listen with their eyes first, the teacher said, offering a smile that cost him nothing. A collared shirt can open a door. Jamal thanked him and kept walking because he had these conversations filed under gravity. Constant, invisible, not arguable. The night before the event, the sky shed its usual threat of rain and settled for a cold that crept into bones like a curious stray. Jamal came home late from the store with a smell of citrus clinging to his sleeves and his fingers stiff from breaking boxes. His grandmother was already in her chair by the window, the television muted, the closed captions marching calmly across a scene no one was listening to. He kissed her cheek and felt the dry softness of her skin and the faint tremor of fatigue that sometimes hid behind her smile. She asked, as she did every night, whether he had eaten, and he said yes, as he did every night, because if one of them was going to lie, it could at least be about something that would not hurt anybody. In his room, he laid the notebook on the quilt and took a shower that made the mirror cloudy and his back relax. Steam eased the day's grip. When he returned, a glass of water and 2 slices of buttered toast had appeared on his desk the way small miracles sometimes do. Without announcement, as if they had always belonged there, he sat, intending to add a single line that had nagged him through the bus ride home. Something about the way silence can be armor and also weight. The apartment had settled, the clock was nearing a number that sounded like sleep, and the radiator was telling one of its long metal stories about heat. He wrote, crossed out, wrote again, and then paused because the door had opened with the soft authority of someone who has known you since your first breath and never needed permission. His grandmother stepped in holding a laundry basket that looked too heavy for the narrowness of her wrists, but before he could rise, she set the basket down and looked not at him but at the notebook, which he had forgotten to slide under the pillow as he usually did. Her eyes, already shiny from the dry air, brightened further, not with tears at first, but with the focus of a reader who recognizes handwriting the way others recognize a face in a crowd. She reached for the book as one might reach for a holy thing, slowly, palms up, requesting and receiving it all at once. Jamal felt a small alarm in his chest. Not fear exactly, just the sensation of a secret learning to breathe in a larger room. He did not move to stop her. He straightened his back without knowing he was doing it. She opened to a page in the middle where the paper curled from having been pressed by his hand night after night. She read standing up for a few lines, then sat on the edge of his bed and let the words carry her forward. He noticed the moment her breath changed, the way a singer's chest changes when she finds a key. Her lips moved slightly, tasting certain syllables as if they were spices she had not used in years but remembered instinctively. When she closed the book, it was not because she was finished, but because something in her was full. She did not offer the praise that makes poems brittle. She did not suggest edits. She did not speak his parents' names, which sometimes enter rooms uninvited and rearrange the furniture of his thoughts. Instead, she set the notebook on her lap, placed one hand over it, and then with the other reached for him. It was a simple gesture that carried many others inside it, like a nesting doll of tenderness. He stepped forward and she stood, and there in the small space between the bed and the dresser, they became the same height, for a fraction of a second, old time and new time perfectly aligned. Her arms went around him, Not urgently, not as if to rescue him from anything, but as if to mark the fact that he brought the truth home and laid it on the table like bread. Her cheek pressed against his hoodie, and he felt the wet of her tears without hearing a sound. Silence filled the room in the way water fills a basin, evenly, without hurry, reflecting the lamp's soft circle, returning their faces to them as if to say, "This is who you have been and who you are and who you might yet be." She did not need words, and he did not search for them. When she finally let him go, her hands lingered on his shoulders, light but steady, and the look she gave him was a promise written without ink. "Tomorrow, when the lights are on you, I will be there, and whether they understand or not, you will know that somebody already does." The gymnasium-turned-auditorium hummed with electricity that had nothing to do with wires or bulbs. The folding chairs creaked under the weight of anticipation, the kind that made every cough or shuffle of shoes sound louder than it should. Families crowded the aisles with cell phones poised like hunting spears, hungry for the moments that would later live online. Performers clustered backstage, sequins catching the light, fingers twitching over guitar strings, whispered counts fluttering to the curtain gap. Jamal waited among them, his hood pulled low, one hand resting in the pocket where a piece of folded paper reminded him that even words need anchors. His grandmother sat in the second row, her posture proud despite the slow pace with which she had climbed the stairs. She wore a scarf he recognized from Sundays at church, a signal that tonight meant ceremony. The sight of her steadied him more than any rehearsal could. The first half of the program swept by in bursts of noise and color. A girl in red tap shoes hammered out a rhythm that drew claps in the crowd. A comedy duo forgot their punchline and dissolved into laughter that somehow worked in their favor. A violin solo made even the restless middle schoolers pause for a few breaths. Between acts, the judges scribbled notes, leaning close to confer, their pens darting like small nervous birds. Jamal kept his corner, eyes steady on the curtain's edge, the fabric trembling each time someone brushed past it. He heard his name once, called by a stagehand confirming order, and the sound had felt foreign, like a word borrowed from another language. He repeated it silently, reminding himself that the syllables were his and no one else's to define. When intermission ended, the lights dimmed into a hush that gathered everyone back into focus. The announcer, a senior with the exaggerated cheer of someone auditioning for a future in broadcasting, introduced the next act with enthusiasm that faltered slightly when he reached Jamal's name. The pause was not long, but long enough for the audience to notice. A murmur rippled across the rows as if the crowd were adjusting itself, recalibrating expectations. Then, clear enough to leave no room for hesitation, the voice declared, "Please welcome Jamal Williams," spoken word. Applause followed, polite but questioning, like the polite tap of fingers on a closed door. Jamal stepped forward. The stage lights leapt on him with an intensity that felt like interrogation at first, hot and blinding, forcing him to lower his gaze until his eyes adjusted. His sneakers squeaked against the wood, a small betraying sound. He reached the microphone stand, adjusted it with a steady hand, and let the silence between himself and the crowd stretch, not out of nerves, but because he needed to claim the space before giving it away. The hood shadowed his face, and he left it that way. He could feel the audience watching, the weight of their uncertainty pressing forward, as if to tip him off balance. His grandmother's stillness in the second row anchored him. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice carried no tremor. The words began quietly, almost conversational, as though he were speaking to someone sitting across a kitchen table. He told them about walking down streets where eyes cut deeper than knives, about being followed not by friends but by suspicion, about a world that could not imagine a boy in a hoodie carrying anything worth listening to. His cadence shifted, rising like waves against a seawall, his breath driving the lines with urgency that surprised even him. He was not reading from the folded page. He had memorized every word, but each line sounded newly born, raw as if discovered in that very moment. The auditorium reacted not with gasps or applause, but with silence more profound than noise. Even the restless middle schoolers stilled, their soda straws paused mid-sip. Teachers who had spoken to him only through directives found themselves leaning forward, their pens forgotten. The judges stopped writing altogether. It was the kind of silence that meant listening, not indifference. Jamal felt it gather around him, Not heavy but vast, a hollow finally echoing back his voice. He spoke of his grandmother, her lungs fighting to climb to the second floor, her hands that smelled faintly of lavender lotion and determination. He spoke of working late shifts, of filling shelves while his peers filled social feeds, of words scribbled under dim lamps when the city's noise finally loosened its grip. He spoke of parents shaped like absences and the way absence can become its own inheritance. The rhythm of his lines carried both ache and defiance, braided so tightly they could not be separated. Each verse was a window forced open in a building too long shuttered. As his voice swelled toward the final stanza, he lifted his head fully into the light for the first time. The shadow of the hood receded just enough to reveal his face. Not a threat, not a stereotype, but a boy bearing truths too heavy for 16 years, yet carried with a poise that silenced prejudice. His last words landed with a clarity that felt like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward beyond the walls of the auditorium. Then, without flourish, he reached up, grasped the edge of the hood, and pulled it back. The gesture was not dramatic. It was simple, deliberate. Light struck his features, his eyes damp but unwavering, his jaw tight with the effort of holding nothing back. The audience inhaled collectively, as if realizing they'd been holding their breath the entire time. Jamal stood there in that shared inhale, sweat cooling on his brow, chest rising and falling like a runner at the end of a race. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Not a clap, not a cough, not a shuffle. Just silence that tasted different now, a silence that honored rather than doubted. And in that silence, Jamal felt the weight he had carried, of assumptions, of whispers, of glances sharp as broken glass, shift ever so slightly, not lifted, not gone, but acknowledged, as if the crowd had finally seen the boy beneath the hood and the words that had been waiting inside him all along. The first clap came from somewhere in the back row, sharp and solitary, as though someone had startled themselves into it. Then another joined, and another, until the sound rolled forward like thunder, cresting over the audience. Chairs scraped the floor as people rose to their feet, the applause swelling into something less like noise and more like release. The room seemed to tremble with it. Students who had whispered about Jamal in the hallways now shouted his name as if the syllables were newly minted. Parents who had eyed him warily when he first walked and now clapped until their palms reddened. Even Ms. Mackenzie, who had guarded her expressions like valuables all evening, pressed both hands to her face before lowering them to reveal tears streaking her cheeks. Jamal stood still in a storm of recognition, his chest heaving, his hood down, the sweat cooling at his temples. He had never imagined an ovation this large, this unanimous. For a moment, he wondered if the silence that had come before had been an illusion, if he had misread it. But no, the applause that thundered now was proof of what that silence had meant. They had truly heard him. He bowed his head once, not deeply, but enough to mark gratitude, and stepped back from the microphone. The stage lights caught the edge of his hoodie as he turned, making it shine like fabric lit from within. Backstage, a rush of students converged on him. A boy from the basketball team slapped his shoulder, grinning as though they had just won a championship. A girl in a sequin dress, still breathless from her own performance, told him she had never heard words hit like that before. One of the dancers asked if he had more poems, and another student, who had barely spoken to him in the hallways all year, simply pressed his palm against Jamal's in a quiet high five that said more than words could. Jamal nodded through it all, overwhelmed but grounded by the knowledge that the work he had carried alone had found soil in other hearts. The judges, too, had shifted in their seats. The man with the patterned tie who had murmured earlier about certain types of boys stood now with his arms crossed tightly, his face a shade darker, as if the applause itself were demanding his confession. When the time came to deliberate, he leaned close to the math teacher and spoke in low tones, but the radio intern, whose eyes had glistened throughout Jamal's performance, raised her voice enough for those nearest to hear. "He didn't just perform," she said. "He gave us a mirror. You can't score that on a scale." The math teacher adjusted his glasses, nodded, and scribbled notes with an intensity that suggested regret. Later, when the winners were announced, Jamal's name was read for first place. The audience surged to its feet again, though the applause seemed secondary now to the look in their eyes. It was not the victory that mattered, but the recognition. Jamal accepted the small trophy, plastic plated to mimic gold, but heavy in his hands nonetheless, and raised it slightly, not as a boast but as acknowledgement to those who believed. He found his grandmother in the second row, her hands clasped, her face radiant, and mouthed a thank you that only she could hear. The following days unfolded like a current he had not expected to enter. On Monday morning, the hallways that had once swallowed him in whispers now filled with greetings. A freshman he barely knew stopped him at his locker to ask how he memorized so much. A group of juniors who usually kept to themselves invited him to sit with them at lunch, sliding notebooks across the table with shy requests for help with their own writing. Even teachers seemed to view him differently. Ms. Mackenzie stopped him outside class, her hand brushing his shoulder lightly, her voice softer than it had been that first night. "Jamal," she said, "you made me remember why I chose this job." Her eyes shone not with pity but with pride, and that difference mattered. In the evenings, his performance began to ripple outward. A student had recorded it on their phone and posted it online. Within hours, the video had spread beyond the school. By Tuesday night, it had been shared across neighborhood groups and local pages, drawing comments from strangers who confessed they had misjudged boys like him all their lives. By Thursday, a community center downtown called the school, asking if Jamal might come share his work at an open mic they were hosting. The principal herself approached him in the cafeteria to extend an invitation to perform at the district-wide assembly. Each opportunity felt surreal, but Jamal accepted them with the same humility he carried on stage. He knew what it cost to write those words. He would not waste a chance to let them work where they were needed, at home. His grandmother kept the video open on her phone, watching it again and again as though each viewing gave her back a piece of breath the illness had taken from her. One evening, she held his notebook in her lap and said quietly, "You've built something stronger than walls, Jamal. You built a bridge." He sat beside her, listening, the city humming faintly through the window, and realized she was right. For the first time, people weren't looking at his hoodie before his face. They were meeting him in the space his words had cleared. But the moment that marked the true shift came not from a stage or a screen, but in a quiet corner of the library 2 days later. Jamal had gone there to return a book. Seeking a moment of solitude, a group of students approached cautiously, their notebooks clutched like shields. One of them, a boy with nervous hands, cleared his throat and asked, "Could you show us how to start? We want to write like you." Jamal looked at their eager faces, recognized the hunger behind their eyes, the same hunger that had driven him to scratch lines in the dark when no one was listening. He took a breath, set his own book aside, and nodded. "The first line doesn't have to be perfect," he told them. "It just has to be honest." The notebooks opened, pens poised, and in that moment, Jamal realized his words had not only broken down walls, they had opened doors wide enough for others to step through. The weeks after the talent show carried a different rhythm, as though the entire school had adjusted its heartbeat to match a cadence Jamal had set without meaning to. He still wore the black hoodie, still moved through the hallways with his shoulders slightly angled, still preferred the quiet of the library to the cafeteria's chaos. But now, instead of avoiding him, students greeted him. Some nodded in respect. Others stopped him to ask questions about his writing, and a few simply said his name like it was no longer attached to rumors or shadows, but to something they could admire openly. The hoodie no longer looked like a warning in their eyes. It looked like part of a story they were proud to retell. Local attention followed quickly. The community center downtown hosted him at their open mic, and he walked onto a smaller stage under warmer lights, facing an audience of strangers who welcomed him not with suspicion, but with anticipation. He performed one of his poems about growing up between absences, and the applause echoed with a resonance that reminded him of the school auditorium. Though this time it felt broader, freer, not bound by walls that had once tried to contain him. A journalist from a neighborhood paper interviewed him afterward, asking what the hoodie meant to him. He answered carefully, each word deliberate. "It's not about the fabric," he said. "It's about the stories people sew into it before they even know me. I wear it because it's mine, not because of what anyone else thinks it means." The quote spread further than he imagined. By the following week, the student council launched a campaign against stereotypes, urging students to wear hoodies on Fridays as a gesture of solidarity. Posters appeared in the hallways with slogans like "See the person," "Not the hoodie," and "Listen before you judge." Jamal's face wasn't on the posters, but everyone knew who had sparked the movement. On the first Friday of the campaign, the school's corridors were a sea of hoods in every color, lifted proudly rather than furtively. Teachers who had once asked Jamal to dress more appropriately joined in, their hoods pulled up as they greeted students. Jamal walked through it all with a quiet astonishment, as if watching the world tilt slightly on its axis. At home, life remained grounded by the same routines. Work at the corner store, late-night writing sessions, evenings with his grandmother. But now his writing carried a new weight, expectation. Messages trickled into his social media accounts. Strangers thanking him for articulating what they had never been able to say, younger students asking for guidance, community organizers inviting him to events. His grandmother encouraged him with her steady wisdom. "Your words are seeds, Jamal," she told him one night as they sat at the kitchen table. "Plant them carefully, and they'll feed more than just you." He nodded, understanding that each poem he released into the world was no longer his alone. With the help of a neighborhood arts program, Jamal began compiling his first collection of poetry. The project coordinator, a poet herself who had published 2 books, met with him weekly, challenging him to refine his lines, expand his images, and balance anger with hope. He worked tirelessly, often falling asleep over drafts only to wake before dawn and start again. When the manuscript was complete, the program funded its printing, producing slim paperback copies with a simple cover, a sketch of a hooded figure outlined in gold. The title, chosen by Jamal after weeks of hesitation, was "Words Beneath the Hood." Holding the first copy in his hands, he felt the weight of more than paper. It was proof that the hours of solitude, the silence of being unheard, had not been wasted. The book launch was small but full of light. Held in the community center's main hall, it drew classmates, teachers, neighbors, and strangers who had seen his performance online. His grandmother, wrapped in her Sunday scarf, sat in the front row, tears shining but never falling as Jamal read 3 of his poems aloud. When he finished, she stood, leading the applause with a dignity that made the moment feel sacred. A teacher approached afterward to apologize for words spoken months ago, and Jamal accepted it not as a victory, but as a step, proof that even hearts once closed could open. The movement within the school grew alongside him. The student council invited him to speak at assemblies, where he encouraged others to share their own voices. Soon, a small group of students formed a poetry club, meeting weekly in the library. Jamal often sat at the head of the table, not as a leader but as a listener, urging them to tell truths only they could tell. One afternoon, a shy sophomore read aloud for the first time, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold the paper. When she finished, Jamal leaned forward and told her, "Your voice is stronger than your fear." She smiled through tears, and he recognized the look on her face, the realization that someone had heard her. By spring, Jamal's words had traveled farther than he could follow. His book was reviewed by a regional newspaper, his story picked up by a radio station that aired one of his recordings. Yet despite the growing attention, he remained the same boy who worked evenings, who carried notebooks heavy with unfinished lines, who sat with his grandmother through quiet nights. Fame did not tempt him, because what mattered most had already been won: the right to be seen for who he was. The final chapter of his school year arrived with graduation. The ceremony took place in the same auditorium where everything had begun, but the air felt different, charged with the weight of endings and beginnings. Students in caps and gowns filed in, the murmur of families filling the room like tidewater. When Jamal's name was called, the audience rose to their feet without hesitation. He walked across the stage in his gown, but beneath it, the hood of his black hoodie still peeked out, as much a part of him as his voice. He shook the principal's hand, accepted his diploma, and turned to face the crowd. The silence that followed was not the tense silence of judgment he had once known. It was the reverent silence of acknowledgement, the kind that gathers when people realize they are in the presence of something greater than a performance. Then, as if on cue, the applause broke. Rolling over him like a tide, he no longer feared being swept away by. He lifted his chin, his hood resting against his shoulders, and let the sound carry him. For Jamal, the hoodie was no longer just a piece of clothing. It was a banner, a testament, a reminder that identity could not be dictated by whispers or assumptions. It symbolized resilience, creativity, and truth spoken aloud. And as he walked off the stage, diploma in one hand, the other brushing against the fabric that had once made him invisible, he understood that he had turned a symbol of suspicion into one of strength. The boy once labeled problem had become the poet who united his school, his neighborhood, and perhaps even more, simply by daring to be heard.